first sign was not a scream, but the harsh sound of failing breath. Sophie Kane, the special daughter of millionaire Edward Kane, clutched her chest. Her eyes widened in fear as the air slipped away. Her pale skin turned bluish, stark against the white dress. She bent slightly, as if her own body were pleading for help. Yet the guests remained lost in laughter and chatter. The orchestra carried on with its soft melody, ignoring the looming tragedy. The glow of the crystal chandeliers spread luxury, but did not reveal the truth. Sophie struggled to breathe, fighting against an emptiness no one could see. Her fragile fingers gripped the golden railing, trying to hold herself steady. Her heart raced, silently begging for help. With each passing second, her struggle became more evident, yet invisible to indifference. It was as if the entire mansion had become an accomplice to neglect. At that moment, the true spectacle of the night had already begun, and the audience, still blind, would only realize it when it was too late. A few hours earlier, the scene seemed perfect for display. Edward Kane reigned at the center of his Newport Heights mansion. The charity dinner was nothing but a facade to showcase his wealth. Persian rugs covered the floors, rare flowers decorated the tables. Men in flawless suits and women in evening gowns surrounded him. Conversations revolved around investments and political influence. Nothing there had to do with solidarity, only with power and vanity. Edward smiled, but every gesture hid pride and arrogance. His empire, Kane International, was mentioned at every table. Everyone knew he preferred being feared over being respected. As he flashed his vain smiles, his eyes hunted for flaws. He always found something or someone to make the target of his disdain. That was how he reinforced his image of being unshakable. And no one dared to confront him on his own territory. But that night held something even he would not be able to control. That was when Clara Duarte, one of the maids, entered his line of sight. She walked quietly, balancing a tray of wine glasses. Her calm face hid the exhaustion of long days and sleepless nights. Her simple uniform clashed with the extravagance of the guests. Even in silence, she carried dignity in every measured step. A slip, however, changed the course of the evening. A drop fell on the tablecloth. Edward raised his voice, turning an accident into a cruel spectacle. "You can't even serve properly, can you?" he said, drawing forced laughter. Clara felt her face burn, but kept her chin lifted, refusing to yield. Eyes shifted away, some complicit, others ashamed. Humiliation spread through the hall like an invisible poison. Edward smiled, satisfied, as if he had reaffirmed his greatness. But from the top of the stairs, Sophie watched the scene in silence. The girl's tearful eyes reflected pain, shame, and revolt. And while her father laughed, her chest was already fighting its secret battle for air. Edward Kane stood tall at the center of the hall, as if he owned not only the mansion but also the people within it. His dark suit reflected the light of the crystal chandeliers, making his presence even more imposing. With each step, he made it clear he dominated not only business but also attention. He spoke loudly, turning conversations into speeches and opinions into decrees. His guests, used to his arrogance, laughed at his provocations as if they were clever jokes. But in truth, there was no humor, only the display of power of a man who needed to belittle others to feel grand. Edward's eyes scanned every corner of the hall, alert to any imperfection. It was as if he hunted flaws solely to prove his superiority. Clara Duarte, still serving quietly among the tables, was an easy target. To Edward, people like her were nothing but shadows in a lavish setting. His pleasure was in making the invisible appear even smaller before everyone. And each of his words was loaded with irony, like a dagger disguised as laughter. This was the image he cultivated. Cruel, untouchable, admired. Yet behind the obedient smiles, hidden discomfort lingered. And that discomfort would soon grow into something much greater. Some guests laughed eagerly at Edward's sharp words. Others, however, exchanged uneasy glances in secret. A young entrepreneur looked away, too timid to oppose him. An elegant lady fanned herself, trying to hide her discomfort. But no one dared to confront the host in his own party. The fear of losing privileges outweighed the desire for justice. And Edward noticed it all, feeding on the cowardice around him. Every complicit silence was, to him, proof that he was in control. The more he realized no one would challenge him, the crueler he became. He reveled in being feared, in having the power to silence everyone. In that hall, Edward was king, judge, and executioner all at once. His mansion, built upon shady dealings, had become the stage of his vanity. But there were eyes that watched him not with reverence but with sorrow. Small, tearful eyes that saw more than adults pretended not to. And those eyes belonged to Sophie, the only one capable of exposing his weakness. Clara, while clearing plates and replacing glasses, held her silence firmly. Inside, every offensive word still echoed like an open wound. But her face remained serene, refusing to play into his game. She knew Edward wanted to turn her into a spectacle, and she would not give him that pleasure. Her heart raced, but her posture stayed upright and dignified. It was this dignity that unsettled Edward, though he would never admit it. From the top of the stairs, Sophie followed everything in deep silence. The girl watched her father with sad eyes, unable to understand his cruelty. Every arrogant gesture of Edward's weighed heavily on her young soul. She didn't know how to express it, but she felt ashamed of the man she was supposed to admire. The tears restrained in her eyes spoke louder than any words. The hall echoed with music and laughter, but Sophie felt only loneliness. Her chest began to tighten, as if absorbing Clara's pain, and without realizing it, her small body was already showing signs of fatigue. Edward's night of triumph was heading toward inevitable collapse. Sophie Kane stood motionless at the top of the staircase, her thin hands clutching the golden railing. Her gaze, innocent yet deep, scanned every detail of the scene below. While the adults laughed at Edward's cruelty, she felt a tightness in her chest. She could not understand the cold logic that turned humiliation into entertainment. To her sensitive eyes, there was no mistaking malice for humor. The white dress her mother had chosen before she passed away seemed out of place in that room. Sophie wore it like a sacred memory, an invisible bond with the past. The contrast between her purity and her father's arrogance made the scene even more painful. Every harsh word from Edward struck her like a stone being thrown, and every complicit laugh from the guests deepened her loneliness. Sophie blinked rapidly, trying to stop the tears from falling in front of everyone. But the lump in her throat was so strong it nearly choked her on its own. Her chest rose and fell irregularly, revealing growing fragility. And in the back of her mind, one persistent thought echoed. This was wrong. The most luxurious party in the city was nothing more than a stage of injustice. From above, Sophie searched for Clara Duarte's eyes among the guests. When their eyes met, the girl felt an inexplicable relief. It was as if, at that moment, she had found refuge amid the chaos. Clara said nothing, but her expression conveyed dignity and strength. It was unlike anything Sophie saw around her. There was truth in her silence. The girl wanted to run to her, hug her, and apologize on her father's behalf. But the rigid social rules of the mansion held her still. The environment felt like a golden prison, where even gestures were controlled. Sophie looked away, but the invisible bond between the two was already formed. Every time she coughed quietly, her eyes sought Clara again, as if only the silent presence of the maid gave her courage. Her cough became more frequent, but discreet enough to go unnoticed. It was her body announcing, in secret, what no one was ready to hear. And with every second of neglect, the inevitable tragedy drew closer. A storm was about to break over the golden night. Edward, however, noticed nothing beyond himself. To him, Sophie was merely an extension of the prestige he carried. He did not see the sadness in his daughter's eyes, nor the effort in each restrained breath. While he spoke of million-dollar deals, the girl battled a growing discomfort. Her lips began to tremble, and her hands sweated cold against the railing. But in silence, Sophie kept her pain to herself, unable to interrupt the spectacle. The whole world felt too small to hear her voice. The party roared on, blind to the weakening of a child's heart. And Clara, glancing discreetly, already felt a restlessness in her chest. It was as if her soul sensed the weight of what was to come. Sophie closed her eyes for a moment, trying to recover her strength. When she opened them again, the sight of the hall was already blurred. Colors blended together as if reality itself was beginning to fade. The girl was alone in her invisible battle for air, and soon, everyone would be forced to face what they had ignored. Clara Duarte moved between the tables with measured steps, balancing trays as if holding her own destiny. Her heart still burned from Edward's cruel words, yet her face remained serene. Inside her, the shame pulsed like an open wound, but it did not show in her posture. She knew that every curious glance from the guests sought a sign of weakness, and if she gave in, the humiliation would only become an even greater spectacle. So she kept her chin raised, even if her soul was in pieces. Clara had long since learned that silence was often her only defense. It was in that silence that she hid not only her pain but also her strength. She would not be defined by complicit laughter nor by cruel remarks. Her greatest pride was knowing she still had dignity, even where respect was absent. The weight of the tray in her hands was light compared to the invisible burden she carried. It was the burden of a life marked by sacrifices and renunciations. And deep in her heart, a timid flame insisted on not going out. She didn't know it yet, but that quiet fire would be the difference between life and death. That night, Clara was beginning to become the protagonist of the story everyone ignored. As she cleared plates and replaced glasses, memories came to her mind like distant echoes. Clara had not always been a maid. She once wore the white coat of a nurse. She recalled long nights in hospitals, racing against time beside patients. She knew the sound of a chest failing, the despair of a family begging for help. She had felt the weight of holding hands pleading for one more breath of life. But a cruel and unexpected personal tragedy had driven her from that path. Alone, she had to leave the profession she loved to care for her sick mother. Opportunities vanished, leaving her only with heavy, underpaid work. Now, hidden behind a tray, she carried that past in silence. Every cruel word from Edward was a reminder of the fall she had suffered, but it also reignited the memory of everything she still knew how to do. Inside her, a voice insisted, "You are not just what they see in you." That voice, asleep for years, began to awaken amid the humiliation. And soon, destiny would give her the chance to prove it before them all. A chance that would come not by choice, but by necessity. Edward, meanwhile, continued savoring his own spectacle. Between sips of wine and venomous comments, he seemed to feed on others' submission. The sound of his laughter rang loudly, as if he wanted it to echo through the entire hall. The guests feigned joy, though some quietly averted their eyes. Clara noticed those glances but did not mistake them for support. She knew that when cruelty came from rich men, most preferred silence. Even so, she walked firmly, refusing to bow to injustice. Her silence was not cowardice, it was resistance, though no one realized it. Yet there was something in the air she could not ignore, an invisible weight, as if the mansion itself sensed the tragedy about to strike. The music continued, but it no longer filled the room with the same lightness. The guests spoke, but their words sounded emptier than before. Clara took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. It was as if a silent call was already putting her on alert, and that call would soon reveal itself with full force. The hall regained its rhythm as if the earlier humiliation had never occurred. The orchestra, obedient, resumed its gentle melody to soothe the atmosphere. Conversations swelled again, filled with figures and empty boasts. Crystal glasses clinked in repeated toasts, mechanical sounds of vanity. Edward moved among the guests like an absolute emperor. His vain smile once again dominated every corner of the hall. The guests feigned enthusiasm, but the air felt artificial. Behind the laughter, discomfort lingered unspoken. Clara continued her work with steady steps, hiding the pain in her chest. Her silence was the wall against the cruelty still fresh. She cleared plates and served glasses as if nothing had happened. But inside, the flame of resistance burned stronger than ever. And amid all that false glitter, her eyes kept returning to the stairs. There she saw Sophie, motionless, her breathing unsteady, and she felt, without knowing why, that something terrible was about to happen. The cough came first as a whisper, muffled by the noise of the party. Sophie raised her delicate hand to her mouth, trying to hide the discomfort. A few nearby guests noticed and briefly turned their heads, but they soon looked away, convinced it was nothing more than a nuisance. The girl coughed again, this time with more force. Her eyes shimmered with tears, not from crying but from the effort to breathe. The air seemed to escape her, as if a weight pressed on her chest. Edward, busy discussing million-dollar investments, noticed nothing. Clara, glancing up by chance, felt her heart pound without reason. It was as if a premonition had silently pierced her soul. Sophie's hands trembled, clinging desperately to the golden railing. The glow of her childish face gave way to mounting fear. Her small body shrank as if trying to protect itself. But no one seemed willing to acknowledge the gravity of that moment, and that collective neglect would soon become a fatal mistake. Sophie tried to pull in air with greater force, but the emptiness won. Her chest heaved in short, increasingly painful movements. The white dress fluttered, too light to bear the weight of the moment. Her fragile fingers clung to the railing like a final anchor. Tears rolled silently, born from the struggle against breathlessness. The hall, so noisy moments before, no longer had enough sound to cover it. It was impossible to ignore that something was wrong, though many tried. The music drifted into the background, unable to compete with the unfolding drama. Clara, her eyes fixed on the girl, felt a chill course through her body. It was as if instinct shouted a truth no one wanted to accept. Sophie blinked rapidly, trying not to draw attention to her suffering. But her face was already losing its color, growing paler by the second. Her breathing faltered, turning into desperate whispers. Time seemed to drag, each second heavier than the last. And fate, silent, prepared to show its cruel face. Sophie's cough intensified abruptly, tearing through the festive atmosphere. The dry, repetitive sound shattered the music like glass breaking. It was no longer a discrete detail, but a living alarm in the heart of the hall. One by one, eyes turned toward the staircase where she stood. Her body leaned forward, bent in search of non-existent air. Her fragile hands trembled, clutching the railing as if holding onto life. Her once rosy skin now took on a pale, ghostly tone. Each cough seemed to take more from her than it gave back. The laughter, once deafening, vanished in seconds. A heavy silence was broken only by the girl's desperate sounds. Some guests exchanged anxious looks, others stepped back in confusion. The luxury around them lost all meaning before a child suffocating. The sparkle of crystal no longer mattered. All they saw was fragility. Sophie fought to resist, but her breath failed more with each instant. Edward's party was about to turn into a nightmare. Edward, finally noticing his daughter's condition, turned pale like never before. The arrogance that had sustained him vanished in the blink of an eye. He rushed to the stairs, his unshakable posture collapsing. The guests, who always saw him as a symbol of strength, saw only a father now. He called Sophie's name with a trembling voice, unable to hide his fear. His hands faltered as he tried to reach her, as if power no longer served him. The entire hall, once obedient to his command, stood frozen. No one knew what to do. No one dared to act. Edward, surrounded by wealth, was naked before human helplessness. Sophie looked at him with tearful eyes, begging for help without words. Edward's heart raced, crushed by terror he had never known. The negotiations, contracts, and millions became meaningless. The most powerful man in the room now knelt before fragility. His entire life seemed to collapse in rhythm with his daughter's failing breath. Despair began devouring him from the inside, cruel and merciless. The hall, once vibrant, plunged into silent chaos. Some women covered their mouths in shock, unable to react. Men who claimed influence stood frozen, paralyzed by the scene. No one moved, as if waiting could solve the impossible. The seconds ran faster than any thought. Sophie's chest arched in search of air, but life seemed to slip away. The sparkle in the girl's eyes dimmed slowly before them all. Edward shouted, demanding help, but his voice echoed in vain. The sound of his authority no longer held power over tragedy. Every gaze in the hall reflected the same horror. No one knew what to do. Jewels and expensive suits were useless against the suffocating reality. It was as if all the wealth present had suddenly become worthless. Time seemed to stall, but the girl's crisis only advanced. The line between life and death was being drawn before everyone's eyes. And Edward, powerless, felt the ground vanish beneath his feet. The heavy silence suddenly exploded into muffled screams. Sophie could no longer contain the spasms in her chest, gasping in despair. Her tear-filled eyes begged for air, but the world turned its back on her. Edward, seeing his daughter nearly collapse on the staircase, lost control. He ran toward her, knocking over a chair on the way, his heart ablaze. "Somebody do something!" he shouted, his trembling voice echoing through the hall. The man who had once displayed himself as sovereign now trembled like any father. Desperation ripped away the mask of arrogance he had always worn. Guests backed away, forming a circle of helplessness around the scene. Glasses clinked as they crashed to the floor, shattering like symbols of human fragility. Some women covered their mouths in horror at the sight. Men in suits stepped back, looking at one another in paralysis. No one had the courage, no one knew how to react. And with each second, Sophie sank deeper into the darkness of breathlessness. The luxurious glow of the party crumbled before the cruel fight for life. Panic spread like fire on dry straw. A group of guests shouted meaningless instructions, trying to seem useful. Others shoved each other, searching for space to distance themselves from the scene. Chaos consumed the hall, turning the mansion into a stage of despair. Edward tried to lift Sophie into his arms but had no idea what to do. He called her name, begging her to breathe again. The girl's failing breaths were like daggers piercing his chest. His wealth, his influence, his fame, none of it mattered in that moment. All the power he had built over decades seemed like dust before his daughter's fragility. "Please, she can't breathe," he repeated, tears in his eyes. The pride that had sustained him before other men now shattered to pieces. His arrogance dissolved in seconds, replaced by pure terror. Sophie writhed in his arms, unable to respond, fragile as never before. The entire hall watched an empire collapse before a defenseless child. And amid the chaos, only one person seemed to remain calm. Clara watched the scene with her heart racing but her eyes steady. Her instinct shouted louder than fear and the role she occupied. She had seen that look before, that desperate fight for air many times. The memory of hospital corridors flashed back like lightning, sharp and painful. While everyone else retreated, she stepped forward, resolute. Her entire body pulsed with an urgency no one else understood. She no longer saw only an arrogant boss, but a father in despair. And she no longer saw just a rich child, but an innocent life about to fade. The crowd murmured. Some tried to stop her, others just stared. But Clara ignored every gaze and moved toward the stairs. Her silence was no longer submission. It was courage in motion. Sophie gasped, nearly unconscious in her father's arms. Edward, frantic, barely noticed the maid approaching. But in seconds, she would become the only hope in that suffocating room. And no one imagined what Clara was about to do. Clara let the tray slip gently to the floor and began to run. Her firm steps echoed in the hall, cutting through the desperate cries. While everyone retreated, she advanced as if she were the only lucid one there. Her heart pounded, but her mind was overtaken by the cool calm of experience. Her past as a nurse came rushing back, vivid, in Sophie's failing breaths. She knew exactly what was happening, knew exactly what to do. The chaos around her seemed to dissolve into slow motion before her eyes. Every detail, the girl's bluish face, the contracting muscles, was familiar. There was no audience anymore, no humiliation, only urgency. Sophie couldn't wait, and Clara would not let that life slip away. The astonished crowd watched the maid advance with determination. Some whispered, others followed her with doubtful eyes. Edward, kneeling, held his daughter, unaware of Clara approaching. The chandelier's glow reflected on her face, now illuminated by courage. And in that instant, the humiliated woman became the absolute center of the room. "Let me help her," Clara said firmly as she approached them. Edward looked at her for a second, too stunned to react. His arrogance collapsed under despair, leaving him no choice. Sophie was nearly unconscious, her eyes rolling from lack of air. Clara extended her hands, showing not only courage but knowledge. There was a certainty in the way she moved that no one expected. The guests stood frozen, watching the impossible unfold before them. The maid who had been mocked minutes earlier was now leading the scene. She knelt beside Edward without hesitation, as if she were born for it. "Trust me?" she repeated, her gaze locked on his with unshakable firmness. Edward hesitated, torn between pride and love for his daughter. But one choking sob from Sophie shattered any resistance he still held. He stepped aside just enough to give her space. And in that movement, he yielded more than his daughter's body. He yielded his own vanity. Every eye followed the gesture, knowing something historic was happening. The entire hall held its breath along with Sophie. No one dared to move, as if fate itself was in Clara's hands. The sound of the violins stopped abruptly, leaving only tension in the air. The guests' hearts pounded in unison with the girl's silent struggle. Clara touched Sophie's face gently, assessing every clinical sign. Her firm fingers traced her neck, searching for the weak pulse. Her calm contrasted violently with the collective panic. And it was precisely that calm that made some begin to believe. A murmur rippled through the hall. "She knows what she's doing." Other eyes, once filled with contempt, now carried silent hope. Edward watched in shock, unable to imagine he depended on her. The very woman he had insulted was now his only hope. Sophie gasped, her short breaths hanging by a thread. And amid the golden luxury, a child's life hung in the balance of seconds. What happened next would define not only the party, but everyone present. Clara carefully positioned Sophie, tilting the girl's body slightly. Her movements were precise, quick, and firm, leaving no room for hesitation. She supported the child's head, loosened the dress collar to ease her breathing. Meanwhile, her firm hand checked the pulse, weak and irregular. The guests watched in absolute silence, unable to believe their eyes. This was not the clumsy attempt of a maid trying to help. It was the calculated action of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Clara inspired confidence with every gesture, as if she belonged there. Her eyes shone with focus, erasing all traces of her earlier humiliation. She had taken command of the situation, and no one dared question her. Whispers echoed through the hall. "She knows what she's doing? Who is this woman?" Edward stood frozen, incredulous, too afraid to interfere. The same man who had insulted her minutes earlier now depended on her. And for the first time in his life, Edward Kane was not in control. All the power rested in the hands of the maid he had despised. Clara began applying assisted breathing techniques. With firm movements, she stimulated the girl's diaphragm to regain rhythm. She whispered quick instructions for a guest to bring water and towels. Her posture was so natural it resembled a doctor on duty. The guests exchanged glances, astonished by the reversal of roles. They would never have imagined that the humble woman clearing plates knew such things. Every touch of hers was guided by accumulated knowledge, not chance. Edward's heart pounded, torn between fear and hope. At his feet, Sophie gasped, battling the shadow suffocating her. And Clara refused to give up, even in the face of gravity. She pressed the girl's chest gently, sinking each attempt at breath. The sounds of the party had vanished. Only the failing breaths and her commands remained. The tension was so thick that even the most arrogant trembled in silence. The minutes dragged on like an eternity in the fight for life. And Clara's image grew, no longer a maid, but an unexpected heroine. Whispers spread through the hall like wind fanning flames. "She's done this before," murmured one executive, impressed. "She can't just be a maid," added a lady, astonished. It was impossible to ignore the skill and firmness of Clara's every move. Guests leaned forward to see better, overtaken by curiosity. The contrast between her simplicity and her authority in the scene was shocking. She had spent years invisible, but now nothing could hide her. Her former silence had transformed into a voice through her actions. Sophie reacted faintly, her eyes moving as she searched for relief. Edward held his daughter's hand tightly, begging for a miracle. And that miracle came precisely from the one he had scorned. Jewels, contracts, and fortunes. None of it mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the unexpected competence of Clara Duarte. The entire hall no longer breathed in anticipation, but with Sophie herself. And everyone knew they were witnessing something unforgettable. Edward Kane knelt beside his daughter, but his hands trembled too much to help. The man used to controlling billion-dollar contracts had no idea how to control life. Each failed cough from Sophie was an invisible dagger piercing his soul. He shouted his daughter's name, but his voice had no strength, no direction. The guests, once submissive to his arrogance, now saw him broken. Edward was no longer the imposing millionaire, but a father begging for mercy. Sweat ran down his forehead, mixing with tears he could no longer hold back. His heart, once inflated with pride, now beat in a frantic rhythm of despair. The golden walls of the mansion seemed to close in around him. All the luxury he had built became useless before his daughter's fragility. He looked at Clara with pleading eyes, unable to believe what he saw. The woman he had despised minutes earlier was now his only hope. But Edward dared not say a word. Shame silenced him. Fear consumed him. His silence was the portrait of impotence, heavier than ever before. And in that weight, the empire of an entire man seemed to crumble in seconds. While Clara worked with precision, Edward felt smaller with every second. He stretched out his hands, but didn't know where to touch, what to do. Everything he had believed in, power, money, influence, had vanished. The world that always obeyed him could not save his daughter. For the first time, he understood there were forces beyond his reach. Memories of his failures as a father cut through him mercilessly. How many times had he ignored Sophie in the name of business? How many times had he traded moments with her for endless meetings? Now, facing her fragility, he felt the weight of every absence. His chest ached not only from fear of losing her, but from accumulated guilt. The pride that sustained him before men left him empty before his daughter. He was naked, exposed, reduced to what he truly was, a lost father. And in that portrait, there were no more applauses, only suffocating silence. Every tear he shed fell like a confession of everything he had denied before, and every second without a response deepened the torture of his soul. The guests watched the scene in absolute shock. Some still could not believe what they were witnessing. The man who had always intimidated everyone now lay in pieces. No fortune could shield him from the raw fear dripping from his eyes. The jewels, the fine clothes, the toasts, all seemed ridiculous in the face of pain. A murmur spread through the room. He doesn't know what to do. It was like witnessing the fall of a giant, not in business, but in humanity. Edward clutched Sophie's hand tightly, but could not offer a solution. His face, red and wet, could no longer hide his anguish. Each failed breath from his daughter reminded him he could lose her at any moment. And in that despair, Edward realized something he had never considered. He was not invincible, not indestructible, not untouchable. He was just a fragile man, begging for a miracle he could not buy. And the only person who could offer it was the one he had humiliated. Fate, cruel and just, had brought him to his knees before the truth. Sophie's breathing grew weaker with every second, as if air refused to remain in her lungs. Her small arms no longer had the strength to cling to her father. Her delicate face turned bluish, frightening the onlookers even more. Edward wept helplessly, clinging to his daughter's hand as a last resort. But Clara refused to be shaken by the despair consuming the hall. Her gaze was steady, calculating every detail, every faint sign from the girl's body. She knew that time was her greatest enemy, but also her guide. "Bring water. I need space," she commanded firmly, surprising everyone. Some guests, once frozen, immediately moved to obey. It was impossible to ignore the authority radiating from the maid. Every gesture of hers transmitted confidence, even amid the chaos. The entire room seemed suspended, as if the world had stopped spinning. Clara, however, moved quickly, adjusting the girl's posture. Her fingers pressed the right points to stimulate breathing, and her heart beat firmly, guided by the certainty of what had to be done. A few guests stepped closer, hesitant but ready to help. Clara lifted her eyes for a moment and gave quick instructions. "Hold her by the shoulders carefully," she told one of the executives. "Bring clean towels quickly," she asked one of the younger ladies. No one dared question her. Everyone obeyed like soldiers in battle. It was astonishing how authority had shifted hands so quickly. The same woman who had been clearing plates was now commanding the entire room. Her tone was not pleading, but one of unquestionable leadership. The fear in the guests' eyes slowly turned into timid hope. Even Edward, still in tears, followed her instructions without hesitation. The man who had never accepted orders now submitted to that calm voice. Clara no longer saw master or servants, only lives in her hands. Her spirit as a nurse was reborn before the stunned eyes of the elite. And every gesture of hers was a silent declaration that she would not give up. The fight for Sophie's life was now the fight of everyone in that hall. Time seemed to drag like a cruel eternity. Each second without improvement was a blow to the hearts of those present. But Clara remained steadfast, breathing deeply after each failed attempt. She remembered the endless nights in hospitals, battling death. She knew she could not allow despair to take hold. Her eyes fixed on Sophie revealed not only technique, but love. Not love of blood, but love of life, of the child's innocence. As her hands performed the motions, her mind prayed silently. She asked for strength to continue, to not let that life fade. The entire hall held its breath with the girl, waiting for a sign. The murmurs had ceased, replaced by absolute tension. Even the orchestra, which had stopped, seemed to plead in silence. And when Sophie seemed to lose her last strength, Clara intensified her efforts. Her movements were firm, almost desperate, yet filled with hope. And in that instant, the fragile line between life and death seemed about to break. The entire hall was suspended in time, each second an unbearable weight. Sophie remained in Clara's arms, her fragile body surrendered to the battle. Edward, on his knees, wept, unable to control the tremor in his hands. The guests crowded around, forming a circle of absolute silence. No one breathed easily. All awaited the impossible to happen. Clara, sweat dripping down her forehead, continued her steady movements. She tilted the girl's body, supported her chest, stimulated each muscle. Her gestures were calculated, repeated with patience and precision. Her heart seemed to beat in the same rhythm as Sophie's. It was as if she were offering part of her own life to the child. Every watchful eye followed each detail, each failed breath. Edward whispered his daughter's name, his voice choked with pain. And then, a different sound broke the suffocating silence. A fragile whisper, almost imperceptible, escaped Sophie's lips. It was the sign that the miracle was about to happen. A murmur rippled through the hall, but no one dared move. Clara steadied the girl, repeating the process with firmness. "Come on, breathe. You can do it," she whispered, her voice trembling with hope. Sophie gasped, her chest rising and falling unevenly. For a moment, it seemed she would lose her strength again, drawing cries of fear. But Clara did not stop, did not hesitate for even a second. Every movement was guided by her experience and the faith she carried. Air finally entered more clearly, producing a precious sound. A fragile breath, but enough to reignite hope in everyone. Sophie's eyes opened slowly, teary, searching for something to focus on. Edward nearly collapsed as he felt his daughter's fingers move in his hand. Tears streamed uncontrollably now, washing away years of pride. The hall exploded in restrained sighs, as if all were breathing with her. A collective relief swept the room, still mingled with tension. The battle wasn't over, but the first step had been taken. Clara adjusted Sophie in her arms, keeping her in a safe position. The girl's face, once pale, began to regain some color. Still fragile, she let out short breaths, but already more regular. The guests exchanged glances, some crying, others in shock. It was impossible to believe what they were witnessing that night. The maid, humiliated minutes earlier, had become the savior of the heiress. And most striking of all was the serenity Clara still carried. Her strength seemed to radiate through the room, touching everyone present. Edward watched her with tear-filled eyes, unable to utter a word. It was as if he had been stripped of all pride in front of the crowd. The murmurs grew louder. She did it. She brought the girl back. Tension began to transform into restrained applause and discreet sobs. But Clara did not seek recognition, only the assurance Sophie was safe. Her heart still raced, aware that everything could change in an instant. And in that mix of suspense and relief, the night took an unexpected turn. Edward pulled Sophie into his arms with desperation and tenderness, as if he had just received her back from death. Tears cascaded down his face, washing away the mask of arrogance he had carried all his life. He held her tightly, whispering her name over and over, as if afraid she would slip away again. The entire hall watched, and for the first time no one saw a powerful millionaire, only a broken father. His shoulders trembled, each sob echoing as a confession of years of useless pride. He no longer cared about image, reputation, or the watching eyes. In that instant, the whole world had disappeared. There was only Sophie. The guests exchanged silent glances, some discreetly wiping away their own tears. It was impossible not to be moved by the exposed vulnerability of the city's most feared man. The scene had enough power to silence any speech, any false laughter. Edward kissed his daughter's forehead, begging her never to leave him again. Sophie, still fragile, lifted her tiny hand and touched his face in response. That simple, pure gesture made every heart overflow. Edward Kane's empire was not in contracts, but in that recovered breath. And everyone present finally saw it with clarity. Clara stepped back a few paces, her hands still trembling from the effort. She breathed deeply, trying to contain the avalanche of emotions within her. Her chest burned with tension, but her eyes remained steady on Sophie. She did not seek recognition, only the assurance the girl was out of danger. But the guests, swept by a collective catharsis, began to rise to their feet. A timid clap began first, from the corner of the hall. Within seconds, it became a thunderous chorus of applause and tears. It was applause carrying more than gratitude, it carried redemption. The woman humiliated was now celebrated before the very elite who had laughed at her. And every clap that echoed was a blow against Edward's arrogance. Some clapped while standing, others wept as they applauded without pause. The contrast between her earlier humiliation and this recognition was brutal. Clara, moved, could not stop the knot in her throat, but she kept her serene expression, refusing to boast. This was not her triumph. It was life's victory over contempt. Edward lifted his tear-filled eyes and found Clara among the crowd. For a moment, there was no master and servant, only humanity. He wanted to speak, but his voice failed, trapped in emotion and shame. His silence, however, was more eloquent than any words. His gaze carried regret, gratitude, and the awareness of his downfall. The guests also turned their eyes to Clara, recognizing her greatness. She had become, before them all, the center of a night never to be forgotten. She was not only the woman who saved a child, but a living reminder never to judge someone by their position. The weight of the moment lingered in the air as if time itself had stopped. Everyone there knew they were witnessing something historic. Edward's tears mixed with the collective tears of the hall. Sophie breathed more easily, resting in her father's arms, still fragile but alive. Clara stood tall, simple and strong, like a silent beacon. Arrogance had dissolved, leaving only naked truth. And the truth was clear. The heroine of that night had a name and dignity. The applause took time to fade, and in the midst of it, a guest gathered the courage to ask, "How did you know what to do?" He said aloud, still breathless with emotion. The entire hall fell silent again, all eyes turning to Clara. She hesitated for a moment, her tear-filled eyes reflecting painful memories. She did not want to speak, did not seek recognition, but the truth had to be told. She took a deep breath, as if diving into deep waters. "I was a nurse for many years," she revealed, her voice firm but laden with sorrow. A murmur spread through the hall, surprising the guests. It was as if an invisible veil had been torn before them. Clara was not just an invisible maid. She was a woman with a story. Her past resurfaced, bringing with it a dignity no one could deny. The eyes that once held disdain now showed respect and regret. Edward, still holding Sophie, raised his eyes to her in shock. The weight of that revelation was more than he could bear, and every second of silence only strengthened the force of that truth. Clara continued, as if needing to open the wounds she had hidden. "I lost my husband in an accident, and soon after my mother fell gravely ill." Her voice trembled, not from shame, but from still living pain. "I left the hospital to care for her, but the debts swallowed me quickly. When I realized, all that remained was to find any work to survive." The guests listened in absolute silence, some already in tears. It was not just a story, it was a mirror reflecting human fragility. Clara had been forced to trade white coats for Maid uniforms, but knowledge, experience, and compassion had never left her. She knelt once more beside Sophie, adjusting her breathing. "I am nothing special, just someone who cannot ignore life." Her humility, even after what she had done, touched the guests even more deeply. Each word was like a strike of reality amid all the luxury. Edward lowered his head, unable to face the weight of his own arrogance. Clara's greatness could no longer be ignored. Some guests, overtaken by shame, remembered their own failures. How many times had they despised simple people without knowing their stories? How many lives hid greatness that would never be revealed? The hall, once vibrating with ostentation, now overflowed with reflection. Edward, with Sophie in his arms, felt crushed by remorse. All his fortune could not buy the nobility Clara carried. He stared at her in silence, the words stuck in his throat. The man who had never admitted weakness now faced his greatest lesson. Clara stood tall, serene, with discreet tears running down her face. She did not seek applause, only accepted that her truth had surfaced. The guests, moved, began to applaud again, this time standing. But it was a different applause, laden with genuine reverence. The humiliation of minutes earlier was now just a distant memory. In that moment, Clara Duarte was recognized as a heroine, and no one would ever forget the story that had just been revealed. The hall, still in reverent silence, awaited Edward Kane's reaction. The millionaire, always proud, looked smaller than ever before everyone. Still holding his daughter, he stood with effort, his face wet with tears. His eyes scanned the guests, but always returned to Clara. It was as if he stood before an invisible tribunal of attentive eyes. He took a deep breath, swallowing the pride that had sustained him for years. His voice came trembling, but clear enough to be heard throughout the hall. "I want to ask for forgiveness," he said, with a weight that shattered the atmosphere. A murmur of surprise rippled through the guests, incredulous at the scene. Edward had never bowed to anyone, had never admitted fault. Now, before the maid who saved his daughter, his arrogance crumbled. He took a step forward, as if crossing an invisible abyss. His tearful eyes fixed on Clara's, unable to turn away. "I was unjust, cruel, and blind, and you showed me who is truly great here." The silence that followed was more powerful than any applause. Clara stood still, feeling tears burn her eyes, but she did not answer. It was not vanity that sustained her, only the truth of her dignity. Edward's plea was not just an apology, it was a public surrender. The entire hall watched the scene, moved, hardly believing their eyes. Some guests discreetly wiped their tears, overcome with emotion. Others nodded, acknowledging Clara's strength with respect. Edward continued, his voice choked with emotion but firm. "You saved not only my daughter, you saved me from the worst of myself." Those words echoed like a final sentence against his own pride. He turned to the guests, raising his hand as if casting a vote. "Today, everyone here is a witness that greatness does not lie in wealth. It lies in courage, in humanity, and Clara Duarte has shown that better than anyone." A shiver ran through the hall, followed by spontaneous applause. It was not rehearsed, but sincere, rising from the soul of each one present. Clara, for the first time, lowered her eyes, overcome with emotion. The applause swelled, echoing through the marble walls like thunder. Edward, still crying, turned to Clara and stepped toward her. Without caring for status, he embraced her before everyone, in an unexpected gesture. Clara froze for an instant, surprised by his vulnerability. But soon she returned the embrace, not out of pride, but out of compassion. The hall erupted in applause, cries of approval, and uncontrollable tears. The elite who had once laughed now rose to their feet to cheer the heroine. It was public recognition no one would ever dare to take from her. Edward sobbed, repeating "thank you," as if it were his last word. And each time he said it, the weight of arrogance dissolved into dust. Clara remained serene, even as the absolute center of the night. There was no pride in her eyes, only the certainty she had done what was right. The scene would become legendary, retold for years as an example of humanity. In that instant, the party ceased to be remembered for its luxury. It became remembered as the night dignity triumphed over power. The hall was still vibrating with applause as Clara stepped back, trying to catch her breath. Her simple uniform contrasted with the expensive dresses and flawless suits around her. But, paradoxically, she was the one emanating greatness in the crowd. No jewel shone brighter than her courage. No fortune outweighed her humanity. The guests no longer looked at her as a maid, but as a symbol of dignity. The woman once humiliated before everyone now stood tall as a heroine. The echo of applause rang like delayed, yet necessary justice. Sophie, still in her father's arms, smiled faintly when her eyes met Clara's. It was a pure smile, full of childlike gratitude, carrying a truth impossible to erase. The girl knew, deep in her innocence, who had saved her life. Edward, on the other hand, was no longer the same man as hours before. The weight of his arrogance had been torn away by pain and remorse. And standing before Clara, he discovered his wealth did not make him great. What made him small was his inability to see human worth. And that lesson would never be forgotten by him or by anyone present. The silence that followed the applause was filled with reflection. Some guests, moved, averted their eyes, ashamed of themselves. They realized that, like Edward, they too had laughed at the woman moments before. Now they stood before living proof that no one should ever be judged by appearance. Clara remained firm, with discreet tears, but without pride. Her victory was not over Edward, but over the injustice she had carried for years. She did not need titles or fortune to be respected. Her strength lay in character, in courage, and in her silent love for life. Every look cast at her was like a collective apology. The humiliation suffered that night had turned into reverence. The contrast was so powerful that many would never erase it from memory. Clara had become not only Edward's daughter's heroine. She had become a symbol for all who had ever been belittled. Greatness, after all, can be born in the most unlikely places. And there, before the elite of Newport Heights, that truth was sealed. When the mansion's lights began to dim, the lesson was already engraved. Not on the golden walls, but in the hearts of all who had witnessed the scene. That night would not be remembered for the millions raised. It would not be remembered for the chandeliers or the finest wine. It would be remembered as the night a maid proved dignity has no uniform. Clara Duarte's name would echo as a reminder of humanity amid pride. Edward, with Sophie in his arms, knew he would never be the same man again. And the girl, with her sweet gaze, would forever carry the memory of who saved her. The guests left the mansion in silence, each reflecting on their own lives. And for a long time that story would be told and retold across the city. A powerful reminder: never underestimate someone because of their position, for true worth is not measured by wealth, but by character. Clara walked down the back corridor, away from the spotlight. But even without seeking it, she had already won an eternal place in every heart. And the story of that night would never cease to exist. If the story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on the notification bell so you won't miss a new video. And of course, leave your like, because it helps the channel continue bringing touching stories like this one. Thank you so much for your support.